Hello and welcome to episode 81 of The Garden Log with me, Ben Dark. I am a gardener and this is a gardening podcast. This week I am talking about the value of hard work in the garden, the physical and mental well-being that comes from stretching yourself to your limits, whatever those limits might be. I'm talking about the effects of wind, particularly summer wind, a very different beast to autumn wind or winter wind. I'm talking about some tree planting some purple beech, one of the Fagus sylvatica reversii, and planting a nice big yellow tree. I'll leave that one as a surprise. You can start working through your favourite yellow trees, see if you've matched them up to mine. I touch on hedges briefly and finish by recommending a book for those of you who have a fondness for nature. I suspect that most listeners to this podcast could count nature as a subcategory of interest. There's quite a lot to get through, so I won't linger in protracted introduction, and I will say let's get on with the week in gardening. Welcome to the week in gardening, a week that straddled the last week of June 2020 and the first week of July. Not that it felt like it. There was a hint of autumn in the air and on the lawns in the shape of many shredded and discarded leaves. We had gusts and gales ripping through the garden in succession, a series of Atlantic low-pressure swirls dashing across the map and stealing hats away and shredding umbrellas and making the garden look particularly unseasonal. I don't really like high summer wind. It makes me worry about stems fracturing and blooms being shredded, and perversely, it seems to unify a garden. You think that wind would be something that brought change and life to the place, but I think it works in an opposite way somehow. I think a little bit of breeze is perfect for bringing out the individual natures of plants, because it tickles them and makes them behave in their idiosyncratic way. Movement is so important when picking plants, and a little breeze will make the grasses wave their emergent seeds, and it'll make the alchemilla nod its head, and all of the little nepeta swirl its little blue skirts around. And that's lovely, and walking through a garden with a soft waft of air in it really lets the plants disport themselves to their full advantage. But in real wind, it is the opposite. A gust blows everything forwards and back and forwards again, or sideways, or wherever, in complete harmony, which flattens everything into its neighbouring plants somehow. It's like taking a lovely head of curly hair with little licks and tufts and cute little forming ringlets, and then getting a big slab of gel and sticking it down there and combing all the thing sideways and back and saying, there you go, off you go to the wedding now. It doesn't do any favours to the garden. Anyway, that's a way of saying that on Monday I went around clearing up some wind damage, picking up the tips of trees from the lawn. That's the thing as well. It's sad when they get blown off before their time, because you don't lose individual leaves. You lose the new growth from the season at the end of a branch. Not much of it, but enough to make you think, oh gosh, that was a wasted spring. On Tuesday we moved into a more creative sphere and got on with some tree planting. I was planting a fairly big specimen tree, and that was a very good purple beech, a Fagus sylvatica reversii. And Fagus sylvatica reversii has very, very dark purple leaves, almost black, and they're big. It's one of these trees that is the cultivar really unique. I spent a lot of time searching for Reversiae. I found it out of stock on most groups. I could find all sorts of Fagus sylvatica purpureas and all sorts of Fagus sylvatica atropurpurea. But I wanted Reversiae because it's known for having the bigger leaves. It's like the cultivars Purpurea major, or Atropurpurea macrophylla, or Purpurea latifolia. I think they're all the same plant, but they are the ones with the big leaves, and that's what I wanted. I think if there are any continuity checkers listening to the podcast, they will probably have heard me complain about purple-leaved plants in the past. I think I called them a light suck and a blight on the urban environment. And I must remind the listeners that I like purple-leaf plants. I read quite a lot of them, Sambucus black lace and various purple beech and other things. I just don't like them on an urban street. I think that on an urban street, they do suck the light out of it. I stand by that. I think that a house in stone or brick or render or whatever you've got on it, wood cladding, tiles, anything, it needs something green next to it to suggest life on the pavement and life behind the windows and the fact that you can escape. There is nature out there somewhere. And a big heap of black leaves in the street doesn't do that in the right way. But a garden's different. A garden's full of green. It's saturated with this stuff. We need a break. We need something not green to remind us how green and alive the green really is. And that's where a really majestic, big copper beech standing tall in the environment, a forest giant there, can look absolutely magnificent. And Reversiae is the beech for me. It's quite interesting. It's from Reversiae. It's just named after the nurseryman who selected the clone. The Rivers Nursery stopped trading in the 1980s, and it developed the Reversiae beech way back in the 1860s or 70s. And I've always thought it would be interesting to look at the area in which the nursery stood, which is Strawbridgeworth. That's on the Hertfordshire and Essex border, in between Stansted Airport and all of those unlovely towns that have sprung up in the area in the intervening century. But it would be great to look at that from a satellite and count the amount of purple beeches, which would now be growing to 150, 160, 170 years old. They would be trees at their mature and best. And it would be interesting to see if there is an epicenter, if we could find where the nursery was purely from tracing back the lines of the copper beech. If anyone is still on furlough, then perhaps that could be a job. Anyway, that was Tuesday, getting that into its planting pit. And it's going to look very, very effective. The leaves on it are so beautiful and large and big. It'll almost be a shame when it shoots up and it stops being a thing you can handle on a human scale, with all the stems and branches there for you to fondle and examine, and becomes a great mass of trunk and leaves high in the air. After that was in the ground, we continued with the theme of unusual foliage colours and planted a very yellowy, bright-leaved tree, a Gladitsia triacanthos sunburst, which is an incredibly vibrant, bright yellow tree with a compound leaf. It looks a lot like the Robinia pseudoacacia freesia cultivar, which grows into a vast tree, and the Gladitsia will grow, but not quite as big. I've never seen so much tree from such a small pot as the one we planted. It was 35 litres, and 35 litres is enough for one person to carry around fairly happily. I'd say you could carry it up 3 flights of stairs with a pause on one of the landings quite happily. You wouldn't want to go any further than that. And the tree that came out of this pot was probably 3 metres tall, over 3 metres tall, with a big bamboo stake. And it has wonderfully soft, tactile-looking bark. It looks tropical and snake-like, the bark almost. And I wanted that because there's a corner of the garden that seems a bit dark. There's a lot of dark foliaged laurels and yews and things there. And This is in a piece of the garden where we're battling against these formal evergreens of the English landscape. We're battling to turn it tropical. And there are a couple of very, very bright, very big bananas in the other side of this long herbaceous border. And they need something in a similar, fresh, yes, I am alive colour at the other side of the border to balance them. But I didn't want something so formal, if you can talk about bananas being formal, as another group of bananas. And I think the Gleditsia is going to be perfect there. It's still so bright, and I know that it will have faded over the last few months since it got its leaves. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that next spring as it emerges to poke winter in the eyes and say, my turn now. On Wednesday, I was cutting hedges with the electric hedge cutters. It is the greatest thing to happen to gardeners in certainly the time I've been gardening, is the rise of the battery-powered tool, and hedge cutters particularly so, because it was an awful job hanging around with a petrol motor next to a hedge. You'd pump the fumes into the hedge and you'd breathe them back in again. Anything living in the hedge would get stunk out, and there was so much noise and combustion. And these electric ones are just a delight. I mean, they chatter and clatter away. They are whirring their blades around in a finger-severing way, but they aren't the horrible stinking beasts that the petrol ones are. And they're slightly lighter, which was useful when you're cutting a very long length of hedge, like I was. Again, I was doing my obsessive hedge battering, that is, making the bottom wider, only slightly, but definitely wider than the top, so that the lane between the hedges seems to sit in a little cut valley of green. This is a personal preference of mine. I like the way it looks. But horticulturally, it also means that light reaches the bottom of the hedge. The hedge doesn't shadow itself out, which is what leads to that great bellying that you see in lots of hedges. I can't understand. Gardeners are very, very, very proud of their hedge cutting. It's something that gets shared on gardener social media. The look at my hedges. And I can see why, because it is a skill. I'm not very good at it. I see people far, far better than I am. And there is a real focus on that right angle corner at the top, the straight spirit level top of the hedge with a perfect drop off to the side. And that is very skillful, and it is a sign of a great craftsman to do that well. But sometimes you see that on a hedge that bellies out, or worse, has a tulip shape and scanty bits of leg covering with a great swelling midriff. And you think, what's the point? What's the point of doing all of that beautiful work on top? It's like giving a horrendously corpulent, middle-aged fat guy a wonderful haircut and then sending him off in a tight t-shirt saying, "You look fabulous, pal." I don't want to get too carried away with this, so I cut some hedges with a nice, slightly inclined side to them. Thursday was Garden History Day, though the archives remain stubbornly closed in the face of the virus, which meant that the minute books of the London County Council Subcommittee for South London Parks, 1896 edition, remained happily unbothered, sleeping their sleep of 100 years, and I stayed at home and played with my son, which was a joy. Garden history can wait until all of this goes back to normal. Until then, we went for a walk around the local parks and looked at some birds and flowers. It was very pleasant. Friday, back to work, and I was barrowing topsoil and homemade compost. We are increasing the area given over to the cultivation of vegetables considerably. I won't be particularly involved because we have much better vegetable gardeners on the team and in the household than I. We have almost professional allotmenteers, and I cannot compete with that. But I'm helping out in the construction, in some of the less skilled parts of the construction. It's quite an effort. These beds are going up in, well, they're calling them dry stone. They're not really dry stone. They are wet in that they have mortar in there, but the water is recessed so you don't see it. You just see stones incredibly cleverly slotted together, like part of a great mystical Aztec wall where there are almost no joins. And they are in quite a white, light Cotswold stone that looks Mediterranean-y, and with the various olives and figs that are already in that part of the garden, I think they're going to be quite effective, but they take a huge amount of things to fill. When we dug them out, we took probably a skip's worth of soil, but rather than putting it into a skip, we put it into the compost heap, and had a nervy few weeks as we wondered, had we just drowned the heap, or would we be able to create a loamy John Innes type compost? We turned it really frequently with a digger, and actually have produced something quite magical, something that is rich and still soily for that important mineral exchange. Unfortunately, the compost heap is at the bottom of the hill, and now the veg beds need to be filled in the face of gravity, so a lot of wheelbarrow work. It's quite a good way to end a week. Doing a physical slog, you end up with the aching arms and legs and the satisfaction of a day's work done. When I used to be part of a very big gardening team working for an Uzbek billionaire who was building a garden in North London, we spent almost all day barrowing soil, just barrowing, creating mounds and humps and turning his land into sort of a mole-ridden, crazy golf course. And we'd work late into the summer evenings, for the overtime money, of course, and finish absolutely shattered and stagger to the pub to get the feeling that comes from having exhausted the body physically and then overwhelmed it mentally with lashings of booze. It was a good and dangerous feeling, replacing all of the lost blood sugar with calories from cheap fizzy lager. Anyway, I finished Friday with a little reverberating memory of those days. And I got back on the bicycle. I am cycling again, which is the purest joy. It's fantastic not to be sitting behind a steering wheel. I looked over my old season tickets and saw that the last one ran out on the 9th of March. So it's nearly 4 months of atrophying leg muscles and shrinking lung capacity, and now I'm back and able to whiz through glorious Hyde Park and look at all of the little squares in Belgravia, and it's a real joy, but one that I found quite hard to enjoy on Friday, soaked as I was in sweat and puffing hard. I finally struggled back to the safe harbour of South London with another week of gardening under my belt. But enough of that. Let's see if I have any recommendations this week. My recommendation this week is for a book that I'm sure many of you have read, but I've only just got round to, and that is Wilding, The Return of Nature to a British Farm by Isabella Trees. It's the story of Nep, Isabella's husband's ancestral seat in the countryside in the south of England, and their ambitious project to return it to a state of nature, having worked out that farming was both unprofitable and creating a damaged land. The book is persuasive and well written. It's a very passionate plea. Sometimes you get the impression that maybe you don't hear the other sides of some of the arguments, but I enjoyed listening to it very, very much. I got it on Audible and had it in my ears as I went along. And it made me think about a lot of things in a different way. I think that the most persuasive arguments and the ones that I found really interesting were the ones about the habitats we create for the wildlife we want to preserve. And Isabella Trees very, very rightly points out that just because a species has survived in a place, that doesn't make that place indicative of that species' preferred habitat. Just because the last surviving pair of some bird are found on a remote granite cliff face on the most unfriendly stack of rock in the North Sea, where the wind only blows east and the sun hasn't shone for 1,000,000 years, that doesn't mean that's where they want to live. They might have preferred to live in a cottage garden in Somerset, but we've killed all the cottage garden versions of that bird. We thought, well, I'll have that for my supper, or I'll have that because I'm bored. And the only ones we can't reach with our various murderous intents are the ones that live on that horrible grey lump amid the waves. And seeing it there has somehow convinced us that this species needs shards of cold rock in its bottom to be happy. But of course it doesn't. Of course it could live in other places. And the NEP experiment, where everything has been left to go back to a state not of primal woodland, because they have introduced large grazing animals to clear bits of the land, but where the tongues and lips of the horses and cows can't reach, there are thorny shrubs and trees growing, and they're bringing species that were thought of as woodland creatures, such as nightingales, to this shrubland, and they're bringing creatures that were thought of as rock nesting to nest in the trees, because there is an opportunity there. Isabella is very gracious in giving her sources, and she's very clear that she's following in the footsteps of various other visionary projects in Holland and other places that I want to find out more about. But as something to make you think about the landscape around you, I can't commend this book highly enough. It has been hugely, hugely successful, so it needs not my recommendation. I think it's probably struck a nerve, because I think there's something in the British soul that wants to go back to a sort of hunter-gatherer wandering existence, to reject all of that grain farming, all of that European untrustworthy cultivation of the soil. I think we think back to those happy years when we remained an island, eating deer and little oysters from the riverbed, while the Germans and French got on with developing agriculture and a shared culture. And we want to go back to those fur-clad times, which explains much in our culture and our recent decisions. Actually, in conservative circles, rewilding is not particularly popular. We have this chap who visits us in the garden occasionally, and he brings us knives. He gave the gardeners a knife each, and brings us dead pheasants. And he once showed us how to chop those dead pheasants. We were sitting up on the terrace chopping up dead pheasants, and he drops off copies of a magazine called The Field. And I don't know if anyone's read The Field. It's well worth having a look at. It's full of shotguns that cost £200,000, and it has photos like the one at the beginning of Country Life each fortnight or whatever, where they show the latest debutante. But in The Field, it's full of photos of Lady Arabella someone or other, with her spaniel and with 14 brace of dead snipe. And they talk about the best shots on the circus. Giles Brigley Wallop is a must at any shooting party. Invite him for his skill with the gun. Keep him for his after-dinner banter. It's a very strange publication. But anyway, their latest editorial took great pleasure in lauding the estates across the country that are making noises about conservation without resorting to rewilding. So that's my recommendation for you. Go and find Wilding, The Return of Life to an English Farm by Isabella Trees. And if you need to see an alternative point of view, then go and read The Field magazine. It does actually have gardening articles in it occasionally. If you want to infuse any gin with something found in a hedgerow, then The Field magazine is the magazine for you. Don't dismiss it completely out of hand, because it is entirely based around the slaughter of wild or semi-wild birds. Because actually they do kill deer as well. And they also normally have a few shots taken from some well-to-do naked calendar. The ladies of Bassetshire Hound Club have stripped off to raise funds for a new gazebo, that kind of thing. Anyway, enough of that. I have some heartfelt thanks to give to the people who have donated a little something on Ko-Fi. And I want to thank Zoe and Emma and Reese and Elizabeth and Chris Tracy and Lil and John Hickley and Ollie Ross and Lisa Hanson and particularly to Louise, who gave a very generous donation. Thank you very much for showing your support for the podcast, and I have spent your money already. I spent it on some coffees, and I spent it on some wine, and I also spent it on a book. I bought a book called These Silent Mansions, A Life in Graveyards by the poet Jean Sprackland, which I think is going to be a very good read. It's a collection of reminiscences and nature writing based around graveyards she has known and no doubt loved. You'll probably hear a review of it in some future episode. So if anyone else would like to join that august bunch, then you can find the page at Ko-Fi, that's ko-fi.com/bendark. And that's it from me. Another recording has flown by. I'm sitting in the lull here between yet more weather systems. I think tomorrow we're due for gales, actual gales in July, which is going to do some real leaf shredding. All of those magnificent unfurling banana fronds. They will be little bits of tropical confetti by Monday morning. But Monday is a long way off, and until then we can listen to the wind in the chimney pots. Thank you for listening to me, and hopefully we will meet here again for episode 82 of The Garden Log. Thank you, and goodbye.